Hey there. Welcome to tonight's little voyage into the past, where the winters are long, the houses are crowded, and the air is just the right blend of smoke and livestock. Picture yourself drifting off to the gentle sound of a Norse snowstorm, while a Viking family, plus a few cows, huddles together under one mossy roof. And stick around, because by the end of this story, you'll learn the oddly heroic role of fermented fish, and why you might never complain about your neighbor's cooking again. If you find yourself actually enjoying this kind of weird history, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, but only if you mean it. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Let's see if we can turn this into a global bedtime meetup. Now, dim those lights, adjust your blanket, and let yourself settle in as we slide into the world of Viking winter survival, where comfort is relative and dignity is best left at the door. So, imagine it's the heart of a Scandinavian winter. The sun's gone on vacation for a few weeks, the wind is howling, and outside, the temperature sits somewhere between nope and absolutely not. But the Vikings? They didn't even blink. When winter came knocking, they retreated into their sturdy longhouses, those legendary, low-slung buildings that look like someone tried to cross a barn with a giant shoebox. A Viking longhouse wasn't built for style or privacy. It was a survival bunker, pure and simple. Depending on where you lived, the house might be made from thick timber if you were lucky enough to live near trees. If not, you made do with what you had, turf, stone, and whatever else you could pile up to keep out the cold and wind. The roof sloped low to trap heat, and the walls were wide enough to squeeze in not just your family, but a few of your neighbors, and, on particularly frosty nights, your livestock too. Because nothing says home like drifting off to sleep beside something that chews cud and generates more body heat than your average electric blanket. Now, let's talk about that communal warmth. Picture the longhouse as one massive, living thermal battery. You, your siblings, your parents, maybe your grandparents, all packed in shoulder to shoulder. Add in a handful of cows, some sheep, a goat or two, and the ever-present fire pit in the center. This was the original group hug, except instead of warmth coming from a cozy duvet, it came from the combined body heat of every creature sharing the space. Efficient? Absolutely. Fragrant? Well, let's just say that the modern concept of fresh air was a luxury no one could afford. The fire pit was the heart of the home, a glowing, smoky source of heat and light that doubled as your kitchen stove. And about that smoke, if you're imagining a cozy hearth with a nice chimney, forget it. Chimneys were still a novelty in most of Scandinavia. Instead, smoke billowed up into the rafters and, if you were lucky, found its way out through a strategically placed hole in the roof. If you weren't lucky, it lingered, blackening the beams and turning everyone's lungs into wool-lined smoke detectors. Picture coming in from the cold, only to find the inside of your home almost as foggy as the outdoors. But at least it was warm, in a smoked meat kind of way. From the modern perspective, Viking homes might seem unbearably crowded, smoky, and, let's be honest, a little too intimate. Privacy was a rumor, and personal space was measured in inches, not feet. But for the Vikings, the alternative was freezing to death or being turned into a particularly unambitious snow statue. So they made do. Sleeping arrangements? Forget your memory foam mattress and 2 feet of personal space. Raised wooden platforms lined the walls, stuffed with straw, moss, or anything soft and halfway insulating. These beds weren't just for people. Sometimes a goat or a chicken would wander up too. Not because the Vikings were particularly attached to their animals in a sentimental sense, but because another warm body was another degree of survivability. Everyone slept together, stacked like logs in a firewood pile, because warmth wasn't optional and shame had frozen solid months ago. Viking longhouses were not exactly a spa experience, but they did what mattered. They kept people alive. Comfort was something you dreamed about, usually while trying to ignore your uncle's snoring or the sheep's tendency to chew on your hair in the middle of the night. Still, the efficiency was undeniable. Even if nobody went to bed feeling especially well-rested or fresh-scented, they went to bed alive. Fashion, Viking style, was less about impressing the neighbors and more about not turning into an icicle before breakfast. If the Norse knew anything better than how to swing an axe, it was how to layer. And I don't mean a tasteful scarf and some mittens. I mean piling on enough wool, fur, and leather to make yourself look like a walking, slightly startled bear. The base layer, if you could afford it, was linen. Linen was light, breathable, and excellent at keeping sweat off your skin. Unfortunately, it was also expensive, hard to make, and had the structural integrity of wet tissue paper. So most folks skipped the luxury and went straight to wool, thick, scratchy, and everywhere. Viking men slipped into tunics over trousers, with leg wraps that functioned as ancient thermal leggings. Women wore long woolen dresses, layered with aprons and heavy cloaks. Everyone cinched up with a sturdy belt, not just to keep their outfit together, but to hang pouches filled with essentials like knives, flint, and maybe a chunk of hard cheese for emergencies. The cloak was not optional, fastened with a brooch and, if you were lucky, lined with fur. It was your shield against the wind and the snow. If you didn't have one, your odds of making it to spring weren't great. Boots were usually made of animal hide, cattle if you had them, seals if you lived somewhere coastal. To keep out the wet and the wind, they'd slather those boots with animal fat until they were practically waterproof. The downside? You walked around smelling like a well-aged jerky stick. For the hardcore survivalist, there was always the option of intestine wear. Yes, you heard that right. The Vikings sometimes fashioned waterproof layers out of cleaned, dried, and stitched animal intestines. This proto-raincoat wasn't going to win any breathability contests, but it kept the snow and rain out. And no one was going to give you fashion advice when you showed up wrapped in something that used to be inside a pig. Accessories were all about warmth, not flair. Hats, mittens, and scarves, often made from felted wool, which is to say, wool that had been mercilessly beaten until it gave up and fused into a dense, windproof mat. If you didn't have gloves, you just stuffed your hands under your armpits and hoped no one noticed your fingertips turning blue. Food was another line of defense against the cold, and the Vikings took their calories seriously. Their winter cuisine was built on the principle of eat or freeze. Every bite was meant to fuel the internal furnace. The menu? Not exactly fine dining, but it was practical, dense, and sometimes alarmingly creative. At the center of every Viking winter diet were the basics: meat, dairy, grains, and enough preserved fish to make even the bravest modern diner think twice. Fish was smoked, dried, salted, or fermented, sometimes all at once, just to be thorough. Take lutefisk, for example, white fish soaked in lye until it reached a consistency somewhere between food and practical joke. Not delicious, but so shelf-stable it could double as a doorstop. Stews were the backbone of Viking meals. Whatever you had on hand, scraps of meat, root vegetables, oats, even a splash of sour milk, went into the pot, simmering over the hearth for hours. The result was thick, hearty, and just sticky enough to cling to your ribs. Not glamorous, but if you finished dinner with all your teeth and a full belly, you called it a win. Dairy was a year-round staple, but especially vital in winter. Cheese and butter were made during the rare sunny days of summer, then hoarded like edible gold for the lean months. Forget creamy brie or fancy camembert. Viking cheese came in the form of hard, salty wheels that could double as blunt instruments. Good for eating, trading, or, in a pinch, fending off a particularly persistent wolf. They also made skyer, a sort of yogurt cheese hybrid that was high in protein, aggressively sour, and about as gentle on your taste buds as a Norse battle cry. If you could choke it down, you were considered brave. If you liked it, you were probably lying. Grains, mostly barley and rye, were stored in bulk and used to make flatbreads and porridge. Viking bread was dense, dark, and sometimes bulked up with tree bark if the flour was running low. It wasn't winning any bake-offs, but it kept your blood sugar above freezing, which was the real goal. And then there was alcohol. Ale and mead weren't just for parties, they were part of the daily routine. Besides giving a little warmth on the coldest nights, these drinks doubled as a morale booster and a mild antiseptic. If you could get your hands on some, you could almost forget you were living in a smoky shed with half the farm. When winter showed its teeth, the Vikings turned to the oldest heating system known to man, other mammals. Bringing the animals indoors wasn't an act of desperation. It was a perfectly logical survival strategy. Chickens, pigs, goats, sheep, and cows all bunked in, not for the company, but for the heat. If you've ever wondered what medieval central heating looked like, picture a family and a small herd all snoring away under the same roof. The animals were usually housed in a section called the byre, which was basically the original open-concept living room-garage combo. A low wall kept the cows from wandering into your bed, but not from contributing to the general ambience. Let's call it earthy. On the coldest nights, families would migrate closer to the byre, maybe even snuggle up beside a particularly warm sheep, or, if the ox was feeling generous, use it as a very large, slightly damp pillow. There were side effects, of course. The air was thick with animal smells, the noise was constant, and the occasional hoof in the wrong place was just part of the nightly routine. But Vikings rarely complained. They accepted what every survivor knows. It's better to be warm and slightly embarrassed than frozen and dignified. This close proximity to animals wasn't just about comfort. Livestock were the family fortune, food supply, and heating element all in one. Keeping them inside meant protecting them from cold, predators, and the sticky fingers of neighboring villages. Viking builders even designed their longhouses to channel warmth from the byre into the living quarters, a marvel of primitive but effective architecture. But the real secret weapon against winter wasn't wool or fire or even a particularly affectionate cow. It was each other. Communal living wasn't just about survival, it was about community. Families, kids, elders, all crammed together on raised platforms, wrapped in layers of wool and whatever scraps of hide weren't patching the roof. Privacy was a myth, but the warmth was real. Children nestled next to adults. The elderly were treated like family heirlooms, treasured and occasionally used as space heaters. Even the family dog or cat was less a pet and more a portable hot water bottle. Everyone breathed the same smoky, cabbage-scented air and pretended not to notice Uncle Bjorn's legendary snoring. Physical warmth was only part of the equation. Winters were long and dark, and isolation could gnaw at the mind just as quickly as frostbite nibbled toes. So Vikings fought back with humor, rough, blunt, and surprisingly effective. They swapped sagas and sang songs, usually about warriors freezing to death in ways that somehow made everyone feel a little better. Roasting your relatives with sharp wit was practically a winter sport, and nothing lifted spirits like a good story about the time someone fell into the latrine. Feasting was another crucial weapon against winter gloom. During midwinter, they'd break out the food they'd hoarded since the fall, not just to celebrate surviving another year, but to remind each other that even in the darkest days, there was something to be grateful for, even if it was just a particularly juicy turnip. Games and competitions took over when the nights dragged on. Riddles, proto-chess, and wrestling matches that sometimes ended with a sheep in your lap or a cousin crashing into the firewood pile. The goal wasn't just fun. It was distraction from the cold, the dark, and the suspicion that spring might be running late again. At the end of the day, Vikings endured winter not because it was easy, but because they expected it to be hard. Complaining was pointless. Comfort was a rare treat, and misery was just another part of life. Anything better than suffering was considered a bonus. Now that you've got a sense of just how much creativity, stubbornness, and strategic use of livestock went into surviving a Viking winter, you might be wondering, how did they actually insulate those drafty longhouses? What did sleeping arrangements really look like when everyone's packed in? And what was the deal with the Yule festival anyway? Well, stick around, because in the next chapter we're diving into the art of Viking insulation, the surprisingly complicated world of communal beds, and the festival that made even the darkest nights a little brighter. The Vikings had their own tricks for keeping warm, and they might just surprise you. If you're picturing modern insulation, those fluffy fiberglass rolls that itch if you so much as look at them, or high-tech foam panels with more warning labels than a medieval curse, forget it. Vikings didn't have that luxury. Their approach to insulation was less engineered solution and more stuff as much organic debris as you can into the walls and pray for the best. A Viking longhouse wasn't a drafty barn because they liked a brisk breeze, but because it was the best they could do with what they had. These houses were practical, not pretty, and they were designed with one thing in mind: hold on to every shred of heat. If you lived near a forest, you built with timber. If the nearest tree was a rumour, you used turf or stone. Walls could be as thick as your arm is long, sometimes even a full meter, all in the name of not turning into a Viking ice sculpture overnight. For insulation, Vikings went full nature hoarder. They'd cram moss, straw, mud, and even animal hair into every available crack and gap. If it was fibrous, dense, and at least vaguely warm to the touch, or smelled only slightly of goat, they'd use it. The result? Not exactly something you'd see in an architectural magazine, but it kept the wind out and the warmth in. Leaning against the wall barefoot was a gamble. You might come away with a new appreciation for splinters and the persistent aroma of ancient livestock. And those roofs you see in Viking movies, all thatch and mystery, the real deal was even more rustic. If you were lucky, your roof was layered with sod, actual grass and dirt, not a trendy eco-roof, but a living, breathing cab for your house. Turf roofs were remarkable for insulation, did a passable job at keeping out the rain, and occasionally sprouted bonus weeds or mushrooms. Think of it as accidental indoor gardening, or maybe a salad bar for your goats. The floors? Forget hardwood or even tile. The standard was packed earth, possibly topped with straw or rushes. These would be swapped out, but only when the smell became so robust that even the goats gave you side-eye. Periodically, in Viking terms, meant whenever you can't pretend its rustic charm anymore. Windows were rare, and when they did exist, they were more like glorified peepholes. Glass was a luxury. Drafts were a death sentence, and nobody cared about natural light when December lasted 3 months. If you wanted to see, you relied on firelight or the occasional smoke hole. Why no picture windows? Because nobody ever froze to death admiring the view. Still, for all its slapdash construction, a Viking longhouse was surprisingly effective. That mishmash of timber, turf, straw, and whatever else they could jam in, created a kind of prehistoric slow cooker, stewing together body heat, livestock breath, and the ever-present scent of slightly overcooked everything. It was cozy in a way that only people who have never experienced central heating could appreciate. Let's step inside on a typical winter night. The fire has burned low, wind is howling outside, and the darkness presses in, thick, cold, and unrelenting. What do? Easy. You sleep like your survival depends on it, because for Vikings, it absolutely did. But don't picture a cozy bedroom with crisp sheets and a pillow menu. Viking sleeping arrangements were less personal retreat and more group hibernation. Picture raised wooden platforms running along the walls of the longhouse. Everyone, parents, kids, distant cousins, ailing livestock, you name it, piled together on these benches. The bedding, straw, moss, or hay, topped with whatever furs and wool you could scrounge up, and a healthy layer of resignation. There were no sheets. There were definitely no duvets. You used whatever was soft and didn't have teeth. Changing into pajamas? Not a chance. Everyone slept in their clothes, boots and all. Sub-zero temperatures didn't care about modesty, only about warmth, and frostbite was absolutely not interested in your self-respect. Infants were bundled up and tucked in close, while children were sandwiched between adults, not for cuddles, but to maximize heat retention. This was less a family bed and more a human lasagna, layers of Vikings and wool, all pressed together for maximum survival. Couples, of course, slept side by side. But so did everyone who could fit. Modesty wasn't even a consideration. Staying warm was the only rule. If your neighbor's feet ended up in your personal zone, nobody cared. It was called survival, not scandal. Wool cloaks were draped over bodies like medieval space blankets, and animal hides, especially from reindeer or bears, added another layer of warmth. If you had a genuine bearskin blanket, you were either wealthy, incredibly brave, or on very good terms with the local wildlife. In some homes, especially among the better off, or during particularly brutal winters, they'd even heat stones or bricks and tuck them under the bedding. This was the Viking answer to the hot water bottle, efficient, heavy, and likely to leave a memorable burn mark if you rolled over in your sleep. If the fire in the hearth went out during the night, you didn't leap up to relight it. You simply pulled someone closer and muttered a warning that probably translated to, "Touch my fur and you'll regret it." The truth is, sleeping in a Viking longhouse was about as far from glamorous as it gets. It was smoky, crowded, and there was a 100% chance that somebody would be snoring. The air quality? Let's just say you weren't breathing fresh air so much as vintage, pre-seasoned air. In theory, the smoke from the fire was supposed to drift up and escape through the roof or a vent. But in practice, it clung to the rafters like an overzealous ghost and slowly drifted down into everyone's lungs. By morning, your chest might feel like you'd spent the night smoking fish along with the fish themselves, which often hung from the rafters for that exact purpose. Oddly enough, all that smoke wasn't just a byproduct. It actually helped preserve food and kept insects at bay. Plus, after a few winters of this, every Viking probably had the lung capacity of a Victorian coal miner, which is really saying something about historical resilience. Of course, there were downsides. Eyes that stung, hacking coughs, and ceilings blackened by soot. Children and elders had it the worst. Being closer to the floor meant they were right in the smoke's path, because physics has never been sentimental. Some families tried to outsmart the haze by building higher sleeping platforms or huddling close to the floorboards, hoping for a breath of cleaner air. Others just powered through, eyes watering as they stirred the stew, or tried to find their bed without tripping over a half-asleep goat. A few of the fancy longhouses featured actual smoke outlets in the roof, but for most folks, smoke was simply part of life, another member of the household, always present and a little too clingy. It warmed you, flavored your meals, and served as a daily reminder that fire was both your best friend and a constant hazard. If the house got too smoky, you could always open the door and let in some fresh air, right along with a blast of freezing wind that would numb your toes in seconds. But when the darkness peaked, when even the bravest Norsemen started to wonder if the sun had abandoned them for good, that's when the real survival strategy kicked in: celebration. Because you can't freeze if you're too busy feasting, singing, and making enough noise to scare the night away. That's where Ule comes in. The Viking midwinter festival. A heady blend of religious ritual, survival hack, and all-out party. Ule usually kicked off around the winter solstice and could stretch on for days, sometimes even weeks, depending mostly on how much mead was left in the barrel. It wasn't just about having a good time. Ule was psychological armor against the endless dark, a way to lift spirits when cabin fever was at its worst, and everyone was tired of smelling like smoked goat. Families would gather from across the snowy landscape. Animals were sacrificed both for blessings and, naturally, for dinner. And towering bonfires were lit, daring the darkness to creep any closer. These weren't dainty, decorative flames. These were infernos, meant to mimic the returning sun and convince winter to move along. While the fires roared, people feasted on whatever preserved meat they had left, drank ale and mead, as if the cold couldn't touch them, swapped sagas, played games, and, every so often, burst into song. And if you think Viking singing was all gentle harmonies and lutes, think again. It probably sounded like someone trying to sweet-talk a thunderstorm with a battle cry, a mix of joy, defiance, and sheer necessity. The iconic ule log, these days, it's a dessert or a festive centerpiece. But back then, it was a literal log, meant to burn for days, symbolizing warmth, continuity, and the hope that nobody would turn into a Viking icicle. It was both practical and deeply symbolic, as most things in Viking life tended to be. And of course, there was a supernatural edge to it all. Winter was believed to be a time when spirits, trolls, and wandering ancestors were at their most active. So, rituals, charms, and offerings were made, partly to keep the peace and partly to ensure that nobody's goat mysteriously vanished in the night. If you're wondering why so many modern Christmas traditions feel a bit, well, Norse, here's your answer. Evergreen branches, feasting, gift-giving, even the tradition of dragging a dead tree indoors, those all got their start in the Viking ule. The Vikings may not have had tinsel, but they knew how to make the darkness feel a little less endless. More than anything, Yule was about sticking together. In a world without light switches, vitamin D gummies, or any real understanding of seasonal depression, Vikings found a way to create joy from scratch, with fire, food, and the unshakable belief that the cold would eventually give way. And if, by some chance, it didn't, at least you'd go out with a full belly and a tale worth retelling by the next fire. So, as we leave the smoky warmth of the longhouse and step outside into the frozen silence, let's remember what really kept Vikings alive. Not just walls stuffed with moss, not just communal beds layered in wool, but the certainty that, together, they could outlast the longest night. And speaking of wool, that unsung hero of history, our next stop takes us even deeper into the heart of Viking winter. Because in Viking Age Scandinavia, gold was nice, silver was better, but wool was life. Picture this. It's the heart of winter in Viking Age Scandinavia. The sun barely peaks above the horizon for a few hours. The wind whips across the fjords with the subtlety of a slab, and the air is so crisp you can practically hear your nose hairs freezing. In this icy wonderland, wool wasn't just a comfort. It was the real treasure everyone depended on to survive. But let's be honest, gold won't keep your toes attached when it's 20 below, and silver doesn't make a particularly good scarf. For Vikings, there was one true currency of survival: wool. Wool was everything: armor, insulation, and, if you were desperate, a makeshift pillow. Forget about the shiny stuff. Wool was the difference between a long winter's nap and becoming the world's least glamorous ice sculpture. Now, let me be clear. Wool for the Vikings wasn't just some passing trend. It was their secret weapon, right up there with fire, and, if you were lucky, a sheep that didn't mind sharing body heat. They spun it, wove it, stitched it, and layered it into pretty much every garment you can imagine. Cloaks, tunics, leggings, mittens, socks, hats. If you could wear it, you could bet it started as a sheep's outerwear. The reason was simple: wool works. Unlike cotton, which is basically a soggy betrayal once it gets wet, wool keeps you warm, even when it's damp. It's like wearing your own personal climate control system, which is handy when the weather forecast is perpetual gloom with a chance of existential dread. Every Viking homestead, especially the ones tucked away on lonely farms, kept sheep, not because sheep are adorable, and certainly not for the cheese. No, sheep were living, bleating banks of survival. The wool was precious, and spinning it into thread was serious business. It was a year-round job, but winter was when it truly became a matter of life or frostbite. Women and children would gather around the fire, hands moving almost automatically, turning raw fleece into yarn. It was like slowly building your own heating system, one spindle at a time. And don't assume Vikings had no sense of style. Sure, they weren't strutting down any catwalks, but their woolen clothes were surprisingly well tailored. Tunics were fitted to trap heat. Cloaks were cut so you could actually move your arms, and leg wraps were wound with military precision so you didn't go head over heels in a snowdrift. Practicality came first, but that didn't mean everyone looked like a lumpy sheep. In fact, the quality of your wool said a lot about your place in the Viking social food chain. If your wool was coarse and scratchy, you were probably either thrifty or just unlucky. But if you had soft, tightly woven wool, you might as well have been walking around in the Viking equivalent of a designer cashmere hoodie. And if you could afford dyed wool, well, now you were really showing off. Imported colors like blue or red were the height of luxury. For everyone else, let's just say the winter fashion palette was 37 shades of sheep. And don't forget about felt, wool that had been soaked, stomped, and bullied into submission until it fused into a windproof mat. Vikings used felt for hats, boots, mittens, and occasionally to patch up drafty walls. It was sort of like making fabric out of pure stubbornness and a healthy dose of foot sweat, but it worked. A good wool cloak could last for generations, assuming it didn't get burned, blown away in a blizzard, or buried with you as part of your eternal warmth package. And yes, nothing was wasted. Even the tiniest wool scraps got a second life as stuffing for socks, or even the world's lumpiest pillows. Vikings were masters of the patch and repair game. If your cloak had a hole in October, you can bet it was fixed by December, unless, of course, you wanted to experience frostbite in places you never thought possible. But here's where it gets weird. Some of the world's toughest cold-weather people were also huge fans of getting even colder, on purpose. Yes, we're talking about the Viking love affair with saunas and ice baths. Because why just survive the cold when you can stare it down, challenge it to a duel, and then voluntarily roll in snow just to show you're not scared? Viking sweat lodges, called badstoffer, were little huts or pits built from stone and turf. Hot stones would be hauled in, doused with water, and suddenly you've got a steamy, smoky room where you'd sit half naked and sweat like a berserker at a summer festival. It was a brief, humid escape from the frozen world outside. And here comes the fun part. After a good sweat, some Vikings would dash outside and plunge into ice-cold water or roll in the snow, either for health benefits or just to prove to themselves, the gods, and anyone else watching that they were absolutely fearless, even when it came to hypothermia. These hot and cold rituals weren't just macho stunts. They had real benefits. Sweating helped cleanse the body, or at least made you feel like you were doing something about the fact you hadn't properly bathed in a suspiciously long time. The sudden shock of freezing air boosted circulation, cleared your sinuses, and, at least temporarily, made you forget you lived in a house with more holes than insulation. And don't forget the social side of all this. Saunas were communal. Families, friends, or whoever happened to be around would sweat and freeze together, sometimes as part of rituals, sometimes just to bond while slowly steaming their regrets. These steam rooms even did double duty as birthing rooms, healing spaces, and makeshift hospitals. If something needed fixing, heating, or just a good cleansing, the Viking answer was almost always, let's cook it first, then freeze it for good measure. These traditions were so effective they never really went away. If you've ever wondered why modern Nordic countries still cling to sauna culture, now you know. The only difference is, nowadays, they tend to leave the goats outside. But surviving the cold was just the first battle. Surviving the boredom of a Viking winter was an epic saga all its own. Imagine months of darkness, frozen ground, and absolutely nothing to raid or plant. You're stuck inside with your family, the sheep, and the creeping suspicion that you might lose your mind before the snow melts. So, what did Vikings do to keep themselves from going full Norse berserker on each other? First up, winter was prime time for repairs and preparations. Weapons were sharpened, tools were fixed, bows were restrung, and clothes were mended. If your shirt had a hole, you'd better fix it by the time the snow really hit, unless you wanted Jack Frost to get a little too personal. Spinning and weaving took center stage too. Women, children, and anyone with hands that weren't frozen solid would spend hours turning wool into yarn and yarn into garments. It wasn't glamorous, but every stitch was a little insurance policy against the next blizzard. Crafting was another favorite. Winter turned practical chores into opportunities for creativity. Wood carving, making bone tools, or even whittling antler combs became ways to pass the time and maybe add a little flair to your otherwise utilitarian existence. The inside of a longhouse might look bleak from the outside, but step in, and it became a hive of quiet industry, low conversation, and the occasional outburst when someone inevitably lost a needle in the straw. But nothing quite compared to storytelling. Forget Netflix marathons. The Vikings had sagas, epic oral tales of gods, monsters, heroes, and that one uncle who made questionable life choices. Gathered around the fire, families would pass the long nights swapping stories, each retelling getting a little more dramatic. Maybe Thor didn't just kill a giant. Maybe he punched the moon for good measure. The line between history and weird history blurred faster than you can say bedtime story, but the important thing was keeping spirits up. And when stories got old, there were games. Vikings played board games like Nefataflo, a strategy game that would make chess look like checkers. There were dice games that combined luck, bluffing, and, let's be honest, a little bit of gambling. Sometimes families would trade riddles, or even stage mock duels when cabin fever hit critical levels. And, of course, alcohol made everything a little more bearable. Mead turned storytelling into comedy hour, crafting into slapstick, and family arguments into spectator sports. But, at the end of the day, what truly kept the Vikings going wasn't just their woolen armor or their love of communal sweat lodges. It was their mindset. And I'm not talking about the kind of mindset you find on inspirational posters with sunsets and eagles. This was something grimmer, deeper, a bone-deep refusal to let the cold win. For the average Norse person, winter was just another season, like planting time or let's go raid somewhere sunny. They didn't dread it. They prepared for it. They met it with the emotional equivalent of a tired shrug and maybe a sarcastic quip about how it still beat paying taxes. This stubborn toughness wasn't an accident. Viking culture trained people from the cradle to see hardship not as a problem, but as a challenge, a chance to prove themselves. Cold, hunger, pain, that was just character development. Complaining was optional, but enduring was mandatory, ideally with a stoic grimace and a muttered joke about how at least the sheep were warm. And this wasn't just cultural, it was spiritual. Norse mythology is packed with frost giants, endless winters, and gods who powered through suffering like it was just another Tuesday. When your belief system includes an apocalypse called Fimbulwinter, a cosmic deep freeze before the end of the world, you stop worrying about a little slush in your boots. That mental toughness was reinforced every day by the people around you. Weakness wasn't mocked. It was simply ignored. No one wanted to be the one who couldn't handle the dark. So everyone kept busy, laughed at the cold, and poured another mug of mead while sewing their 43rd mitten. Even the kids learned early. If your fingers were cold, use your elbows. If your feet were numb, walk faster. If you fell through the ice and survived, congratulations. Now you had a story worth telling. Was it healthy? Probably not. Was it effective? Absolutely. Modern survival manuals love to talk about the importance of mindset. But the Vikings had that figured out centuries ago. They didn't see winter as an enemy. They saw it as a test, one they'd already passed year after year, with fire, wool, and a psychological middle finger raised to Mother Nature. So, as you drift off in this sleep video of boring history, just remember, the next time you complain about the thermostat, somewhere in your ancestry, someone was out there wrestling a sheep and muttering, "At least it's not Fimbulwinter." And if you're still awake, you're in luck, because next we'll be exploring how the Vikings' greatest survival tool wasn't just what they wore or what they believed, but who they had around them. If there's one lesson the Vikings understood deep in their bones, it was this: winter is not a solo sport. You could bundle yourself in the thickest cloak, fatten your goats until they waddled, and fortify your longhouse like it's the world's first panic room. But if you tried to face those endless Nordic nights alone, you'd just end up as a well-dressed, well-insulated popsicle. Viking survival was a team event, whether you liked your teammates or not. The whole Viking system ran on interdependence. Nobody was out there living in picturesque isolation, composing moody Icelandic poetry by themselves. No, families clustered together, sometimes packed so tight that even the livestock got a pillow. Extended kin, neighbors, and people you barely tolerated all huddled together in villages or hard-scrabbled settlements. When the first real snowstorm hit and the darkness settled in like a bad mood, This network was your only lifeline. Food didn't belong to one family. It was pooled, shared, and occasionally squabbled over. Firewood was dragged in together, even if it meant arguing about who was slacking off. If your roof caved in under a mountain of snow, you didn't have to beg for help. Someone always showed up, usually with a few extra hands and a running commentary on your questionable carpentry skills. And if your child started coughing or spiking a fever, the neighbors would bring whatever they had, herbs, prayers, or sometimes just a look that said, "Yep, that's winter for you." Generosity wasn't purely out of kindness. Think of it as survival calculus. The more people you kept alive through winter, the bigger your work crew once the ice melted. Every cousin, grumpy uncle, or distant in-law you nursed back to health was another set of hands for spring planting, boat building, or herding cows that clearly didn't want to be herded. Even if you had to split your last smoked fish with that one cousin who never remembered your birthday, you did it. Because if they made it through, so did you. The real magic happened during midwinter feasts like Yule. Picture it. The wind howling outside, everyone crammed around a smoky hearth, a table groaning under the weight of whatever they'd managed to save from the rats. These weren't just parties. They were the glue that kept the community from unraveling. Food and drink flowed, stories were told, and someone always launched into half-baked philosophy about the universe after their fourth cup of mead. These nights were about reminding everyone that, despite the long shadow of winter, nobody was actually alone in the dark. Even their storage habits were built for the group, not the individual. Granaries were communal, smokehouses shared. If one family's pantry ran dry, there was a whole system for making sure they didn't starve, not because anyone was angling for sainthood, but because winter was a marathon, and a single weak link could bring down the whole chain. It was less about charity and more about group insurance. Everyone's survival depended on everyone else. Not doing something stupid, like running out of turnips in February. Leadership was about more than barking orders or settling disputes. Local chieftains or priests weren't just there to keep the peace. They had to make sure no one froze in a snowdrift or hoarded the last of the salted pork. Their reputations balanced on their ability to keep both order and the communal fire burning. After all, a leader who couldn't organize a firewood run was about as respected as a leaky roof. And let's not forget the ever-present peer pressure. Try to skip your chores or stash away more than your share, and suddenly the entire settlement would know. In Viking society, being judged by your neighbors was only slightly preferable to being eaten by wolves. Social shaming was the original reality TV, and everyone tuned in. At the end of every snow-choked night, with livestock snoring in the shadows and smoke curling up toward the rafters, one thing became clear. The Vikings didn't just survive winter, they weaponized it. Every scratchy wool tunic, every half-hearted joke around the fire, every stubborn repair to a drafty wall was part of a long tradition, an ancient blueprint for endurance. For the Vikings, winter was never just a season. It was a rival, a test, and frankly, a bit of a bully. And year after year, they trained to take it down. They patched leaky longhouses with moss, thickened weak stew with whatever root vegetables they could unearth, and filled the dragging nights with stories, games, rituals, and, when all else failed, the time-honored tradition of wrestling. a cousin for the last bite. No central heating. They built their own fire pits, thank you very much. No waterproof jackets. They got creative with sheep, wax, and a healthy disregard for fashion. Forget about antidepressants. Vikings had sagas, dark humor, and such relentless communal mischief that seasonal bloom didn't stand a chance. While other cultures hibernated through the cold, the Vikings sharpened their skills. Winter was when weapons got fixed, kids learned new tricks, and plans for the coming year took shape in the flickering firelight. So when the ice finally broke and the daylight returned, these folks didn't just stumble out blinking and confused. They burst out of their longhouses ready to plant, build, trade, or, if adventure called, to row across a freezing sea in search of something better. Winter didn't break the Vikings. It made them sharper, tougher, and infinitely more inventive. They didn't survive thanks to magic or some mythical Scandinavian insulation. They pulled it off with persistence, smoky determination, and a willingness to do whatever it took. Sleeping under a goat? Check. Steaming in a hut that smelled like yesterday's stew? No problem. Eating yogurt with the consistency of medieval grout? All in a day's work. And always, always, they did it together. So, as you drift off to sleep with this little piece of boring history swirling in your mind, remember, community is what got the Vikings through the darkest times. And speaking of unlikely beginnings, let's leave the frozen north behind and step into the wilds of Kentucky, where a boy named Abraham Lincoln was born on a chilly February morning in a log cabin barely big enough to hold his family, let alone the future of a nation. Settle in, folks, and let your mind wander with me for a while. Picture a cold, muddy February morning in 1809, out on the edge of the Kentucky wilderness, where the only thing thinner than the soil was the line between survival and disaster. This is where Abraham Lincoln first opened his eyes to the world. Inside a one-room log cabin built with more hope than insulation. There were no windows to let in the pale winter light, no sturdy floor to keep out the cold, and certainly nothing that even resembled a bookshelf. Instead, there was the ceaseless creak of rough-hewn wood, the constant chill, and the perpetual smell of damp earth and unwashed socks, the original frontier air freshener, if you want to call it that. Now, Lincoln's father, Thomas, was a man of hard hands and harder luck. He could swing an axe and hammer a nail, but reading or writing, not so much. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was a gentle soul, quiet, kind, and, almost unbelievably for the time and place, able to read. She was, in many ways, Abraham's first window into a wider world, even if that window was just the faded pages of an old Bible. The Lincolns scraped by, day after day, with backs bent to the land and stomachs grumbling more often than not. There were no luxuries. Even the cabin door groaned in protest every time someone pushed it open. Little Abe's early years were a patchwork of chores and silence. He spent his days hauling water, splitting logs, and wearing clothes that were more memory than material, patched, faded, and usually a size too small. If you're picturing a charming, Instagram-worthy childhood on the farm, I'm afraid you'll have to swipe left. This was survival, plain and simple. School was a luxury for other people, somewhere else. Later in life, Lincoln would say he had less than a year of formal education in total, and even that might be stretching it. But what he lacked in teachers, he made up for with a kind of restless, hungry curiosity that even the Kentucky mud couldn't drag down. Then, when Abraham was just 9, the world he knew grew even smaller. His mother, Nancy, fell ill, likely from something called milk sickness, which is about as pleasant as it sounds, and roughly as survivable as a Kentucky winter without firewood. She died, leaving Abraham and his sister in a home suddenly much quieter and much colder. He carved her grave marker himself, with hands almost too small for the task, and tears that soaked the wood. It was rough, uneven, and honest, much like the boy himself. Life didn't wait for morning. Within months, Thomas Lincoln remarried, this time to a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston. And here, in the great lottery of stepmothers, Abraham hit the jackpot. Sarah brought not just warmth and order to the household, but something even rarer in those parts: books. She saw the sharpness in Abraham's eyes and did everything she could to keep that spark alive. Where other children might be playing or sleeping, Abraham was reading anything he could get his hands on. Aesop's fables, Robinson Crusoe, the Bible, yet again. When there were no books to be found, he'd take a bit of charcoal and scrawl his thoughts across a wooden shingle, inventing his own library, one roof tile at a time. So there he was, barefoot, skinny as a fence rail, and already looking far too serious for his age. The world had not given him much, but what it had given he made count. He was forging a kind of resilience you just can't teach, if you're the type to fall asleep fast during bedtime stories. Just imagine the gentle creak of that log cabin, the flicker of candlelight, and a boy's mind crackling with ideas even when the fire had gone out. As the years rolled on, the Lincolns packed up and moved once more, this time to the boggy, mosquito-plagued forests of Indiana. If Kentucky had been tough, Indiana was even tougher. The winters bit through wool and bone, and the land was stubborn, refusing to yield more than the bare minimum to those who worked it. Every day was a new round in the eternal wrestling match between man and mud. Lincoln's back grew strong from swinging the axe, but his mind was always elsewhere. In a community where the biggest drama might be a neighbor's runaway pig, young Abraham stood out. Not for his muscles, though he was impressively built, but for his towering height and peculiar habits. Imagine the local gossip: a gangly teenager reciting Shakespeare while mending a fence, or trudging through the woods with a borrowed book balanced on his head, half scarecrow, half scholar. He had a dry, almost sardonic sense of humor that seemed to grow sharper with every year. If someone made a joke about the neighbor's cooking, Lincoln would top it with a story about ancient philosophers, or a sly dig at his own looks. Socially, he was awkward, a little too tall, a little too quiet, but impossible to ignore when he finally spoke. His words had a weight to them, a kind of clear-eyed honesty that you couldn't brush aside. Even as a kid, he hated cruelty and injustice, especially when someone tried to dress it up as tradition or necessity. Slavery, though still far from the center of his world, already struck him as a deep wrong, a stain on the very idea of freedom. Despite his lack of formal schooling, Lincoln was drawn to the law, not the kind enforced by fists, but the kind that lived in words and ideas. He taught himself how to write with precision and argue with logic. He borrowed legal treatises whenever he could, and spent his nights reading by the unreliable light of a tallow candle. While other young men were busy rolling dice or nursing cheap whiskey, Lincoln was absorbed in Blackstone's commentaries and the wild notion that you could bend the world a little if you just learned enough. By his early 20s, Lincoln struck out on his own. He took work as a flatboatman, floating down the Mississippi to New Orleans, a trip that exposed him to the raw, gut-wrenching reality of the slave trade. The sights and sounds of human beings bought and sold like livestock left a mark on him that never quite faded. Later, those memories would come roaring back when the nation began to tear itself apart. After his river adventures, Lincoln moved to New Salem, Illinois, a speck of a town that barely made it onto the map. Here, he set about reinventing himself. He tackled grammar, joined the local debating society, and learned the art of persuasion in smoky taverns and on dusty porches. He didn't have a diploma or a famous name, just an unshakable belief that knowledge, like fire, could be built from almost nothing if you just kept feeding it. When Lincoln finally became a lawyer, he carried with him the dust of 100 country roads. He was already a legend in central Illinois, not for his fashion sense. His trousers were famously short, his jackets rumpled, and he always looked as if he'd slept in his clothes. But for the way he listened and spoke, people leaned in when he talked. He didn't have the polish of city lawyers, but he had something more valuable: honesty, clarity, and a knack for making anyone feel like they mattered. Lincoln's legal career was as unconventional as everything else about him. He never set foot in a law school. He simply borrowed books from friendly attorneys, read them cover to cover, and then passed the bar exam on sheer grit and self-discipline. Once admitted, he hit the road, literally. The 8th Judicial Circuit in Illinois was a sprawling, muddy network of rural courthouses that Lincoln traveled on horseback, sometimes for weeks on end. Spring meant knee-deep mud, summer brought choking dust, and winter transformed the roads into frozen ruts. For Lincoln, this was part of the adventure. He slept wherever he could, crowded taverns, drafty cabins, sometimes beneath the stars, with nothing but a horse blanket for warmth. If you think staying in a 3-star motel is roughing it, try sharing a flea-ridden mattress with 3 other lawyers and a couple of well-fed mice. Yet, Lincoln loved it. He loved the stories, the people, the endless parade of oddball clients and eccentric judges. What made Lincoln such a formidable lawyer wasn't just his logic, though he was sharp as a tack. It was his empathy. He could connect with a jury in a way that city-slicker lawyers never could. He spoke plainly, painted vivid pictures, and treated even the poorest farmer or the loneliest widow with respect. One old farmer once put it perfectly: he makes you feel like he's one of us, not above us. That was honest Abe, through and through. If a case didn't sit right with him, Lincoln would return his fee and walk away. If a client lied, he'd drop them faster than you can say your honor. In court, when he believed in something, he could be relentless. His arguments slow and steady at first, then building up brick by brick, until the other side simply caved in under the sheer weight of his facts. His cross-examinations were legendary. He'd lull witnesses into a sense of comfort, then, with a single question, pull the rug out from under them. Over time, the name Honest Abe wasn't a slogan. It was a fact of daily life. But for all the time he spent on the legal circuit, another kind of fire was growing inside Lincoln. Law had taught him how people worked. Now he wanted to try his hand at changing the system itself. As the issue of slavery crept closer to the center of American life, Lincoln, quietly at first, began to find his voice. His first step into politics was, let's be honest, not exactly a triumph. In 1832, at the ripe old age of 23, Lincoln ran for the Illinois state legislature and lost badly. Most people would have called it a day and gone back to fixing fences. Not Lincoln. Instead, he took the loss as a lesson. He listened more, learned more, and started meeting people where they actually lived, not where he wished they'd be. 2 years later, he tried again, and this time he won. Springfield, the new capital, was where Lincoln's peculiar mix of wit and wisdom found its audience. He became known for speeches that were measured and dryly funny, for his deep sense of fairness, and for a kind of moral conviction that didn't need to shout. He wasn't interested in flash or cheap victories. He wanted to understand the machinery of law and justice from the inside out. He aligned himself with the Whig Party, a group that believed in building things, roads, railroads, and a modern America. They also liked the idea of keeping presidents from getting too big for their britches. But even as a Whig, Lincoln never seemed all that hungry for power. He joked about being too ugly for politics and preferred books and debate to backroom scheming. Politics, to Lincoln, was a duty, a burden he accepted, not a trophy he chased. During his 4 terms in the Illinois legislature, Lincoln built bridges with farmers, shopkeepers, and other lawyers. He was rarely the loudest voice, but often the most trusted. His reputation as a straight shooter grew, especially on the question of slavery. He wasn't yet calling for its full abolition, but he stood firmly against its expansion. He called slavery unjust, immoral, and a national hypocrisy, a pretty risky move in a state with one foot in the South. In 1846, Lincoln made the leap to national politics, winning a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. There, he did something most politicians would rather avoid. He took an unpopular stand. He condemned the Mexican-American War as unnecessary and unconstitutional, a move that did little to win him friends back home. He served a single term, then stepped quietly back from the chaos of Washington, returning to Springfield and his law practice. Back home, he married Mary Todd, a sharp, well-educated woman from a slave-holding Kentucky family. Their marriage was a mix of affection, arguments, and ambition, a partnership that would both steady and challenge Lincoln for the rest of his life. He tried to settle into the quieter rhythms of domestic life and legal work, but the country was changing too fast for anyone to relax. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the ever-louder debates over slavery were tearing the nation in two. Lincoln may have tried to walk away from politics, but politics had no intention of letting him go. The debates were growing louder, sharper, and bloodier. The Union was beginning to crack. Suddenly, the cautious, awkward lawyer from Illinois found himself not just a participant, but a conscience, a voice that would soon rise above all the noise. So, as you tuck yourself in and let this chapter of boring history lull you towards sleep, picture Lincoln, a boy with patched trousers and a borrowed book, a young man with a mind on fire, a lawyer who argued for justice in muddy courthouses, and a politician who spoke softly but carried the hard truths. His life, up to this point, is a story of resilience against the odds, of learning by lantern light and never losing sight of what's right. And as the nation itself edges toward a restless, troubled slumber, Lincoln is about to step into the storm. So, let your mind drift, because next, our sleep story is about to get louder. By the 1850s, the issue of slavery no longer simmered. It was about to boil over, and Lincoln would find himself at the very center of the fire. As the decade unfolded, the question of slavery wasn't just hanging in the air. It was crackling like static before a thunderstorm. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 sent shock waves through the nation, letting new territories decide for themselves if they'd be slave states or free. In practice, this meant chaos. It turned Kansas into a battleground, where neighbors eyed each other across fence posts with loaded rifles. People started calling it Bleeding Kansas, and for once the name fit the mess. For a while, Abraham Lincoln watched all of this from the sidelines, but the violence and the moral confusion finally pushed him past his breaking point. He couldn't just sit there and hope it would blow over. Lincoln re-entered politics, not with a flashy campaign or wild promises, but with a kind of quiet, relentless conviction that something had to change. He threw his lot in with the brand new Republican Party, an odd alliance of former Whigs, Free Soilers, and abolitionists, all of them united by one simple goal: stopping the spread of slavery. Now, Lincoln wasn't a fire-breathing abolitionist. He didn't stride onto the stage demanding that every chain be smashed by daybreak, but he believed deeply, stubbornly, that slavery was wrong, and that letting it slither into new states would poison the country's future. For Lincoln, it was a line in the sand. In 1858, he got his real moment in the national spotlight, a Senate race against Stephen Douglas, who was as famous then as any modern talk show host. They agreed to a series of debates across Illinois that would become legendary. Part traveling circus, part moral courtroom drama, Douglas argued that every state should decide the slavery question for itself, which sounded democratic but played fast and loose with basic human rights. Lincoln, on the other hand, didn't mince words. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," he said, in that slow, deliberate way that made people lean in. He wasn't just talking about bricks and mortar. He meant the entire country could not keep limping along, half slave and half free, without collapsing under its own contradictions. He didn't win that Senate seat, not that year, but he did win something possibly more important: national attention. Newspapers from all corners reprinted his words. People who'd never given a second thought to that tall, awkward lawyer from Illinois suddenly found themselves quoting him at dinner tables and saloons. He lost the race, but he gained a reputation, someone who would challenge the comfortable lies, not out of ambition, but out of conscience. Behind the scenes, Lincoln wrestled with the problem like a man working a stubborn knot. He once wrote, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." Yet he also knew that charging forward recklessly could shatter the fragile nation. The stakes were enormous, and the country's mood was shifting, sometimes by the hour. Lincoln rose with that tide, not as a man with easy answers, but as a rare voice of moral clarity in an age of muddled thinking. By 1860, America was teetering on the edge. Sectional tensions had gone from simmer to full rolling boil. Slavery was no longer just a moral debate for the philosophers or the preachers. It was a political inferno, threatening to burn the whole house down. Southern states warned they'd leave if anyone tried to curb their peculiar institution. Meanwhile, the Republican Party was desperately searching for a leader who could hold together the North without triggering all-out war. That leader, as it turned out, was the last person many expected. At the Republican convention in Chicago, Lincoln wasn't even on most people's short list. Senator William Seward of New York had all the experience, the name, and the establishment backing. Lincoln had none of that. What he did have was a spotless reputation, a moderate tone, and the kind of momentum that comes from refusing to back down in the face of moral crisis. His team worked the convention like seasoned chess players, reminding everyone of Lincoln's humble beginnings, his honesty, and his plain-spoken style. The rail splitter from Illinois became a symbol of what America could be, rough around the edges, but ready to do the hard work. By the third ballot, the unthinkable happened. Lincoln secured the nomination, and the political world blinked in disbelief. The general election that followed was as bitter and fractured as any reality TV reunion special. The Democratic Party split in two, North and South, each side hurling accusations and backing different candidates. In much of the South, you wouldn't even see Lincoln's name on the ballot, but in the North and West, his support was overwhelming. So, on November 6, 1860, Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. He won just 40% of the popular vote, but a decisive majority in the Electoral College. There was no wild celebration. Instead, a heavy silence settled over the country. Within weeks, South Carolina voted to secede, and 6 more states followed before Lincoln had even unpacked his bags in Washington. To say the mood was tense is like saying the Titanic had a little leak. Lincoln's journey from Springfield to Washington felt less like a victory lap and more like sneaking through enemy territory. Death threats landed on his doorstep daily. Security was so tight that he had to slip into the capital under cover of darkness, disguised and unannounced. Not exactly the triumphant parade most presidents hope for on their way to the White House. Picture it, a new president, sneaking into his own inauguration, because his election had split the country in two. On March 4, 1861, Lincoln took the oath of office, facing a nation angry, fractured, and bracing for conflict. Yet his first inaugural address didn't thunder with threats or vengeance. Instead, he reached out, almost pleading, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." But with the wind howling outside, it was clear peace had already packed its bags and left the building. Within a month, the first shots rang out at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had officially begun, a 4-year bloodbath that would become the deadliest conflict in American history. Lincoln, who'd had all the battlefield experience of a weekend paintball enthusiast, was now commander-in-chief of a nation at war with itself. His only real military background was a brief stint as a captain in the Black Hawk War, where he'd seen more mosquitoes than musket fire. So how did he handle it? He learned on the job. the way you do when your boss hands you the keys to a nuclear submarine and says, "Just figure it out." Lincoln spent endless nights holed up in the War Department, hunched over telegrams, poring over maps, trying to teach himself the art of war from dusty books and the complaints of his generals. He was no warrior by blood, but he became one by necessity. Early on, Lincoln's patience was tested by a parade of disappointing generals. None tested his nerves quite like George McClellan, who managed to inspire the troops while avoiding actual fighting, as if he had a personal allergy to cannon smoke. At one point, Lincoln famously grumbled, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a while." There's that dry, sardonic wit that history teachers never give enough credit. But Lincoln's true brilliance wasn't just in learning the ropes of military strategy. He had the rare ability to see the big picture, even when everyone else was focused on the mud right in front of them. To him, this war wasn't just about states' rights or even secession. It was about the soul of the nation. Could a country that prided itself on liberty really survive if half of it was in chains? At first, he moved cautiously on the issue of slavery, worried that pushing too hard would drive the border states into the arms of the Confederacy. But as the war dragged on and casualty lists grew longer than a winter night, Lincoln's thinking shifted. He started to see that slavery wasn't just a moral cancer. It was the engine driving the Confederate war machine. If slavery survived, the rebellion would never truly die. So, on January the 1st, 1863, Lincoln dropped a thunderbolt, the Emancipation Proclamation. All slaves in Confederate-held territories were to be free by presidential decree. It didn't end slavery everywhere overnight, but it changed the entire nature of the war. Suddenly, this was no longer just a battle to save the Union. It was a fight for human freedom. Abroad, it slammed the door shut on British or French support for the Confederacy. At home, thousands of black men joined the Union Army, fighting for a nation that had only just begun to recognize their rights. Lincoln had transformed again, no longer just the log cabin lawyer or the reluctant president, but a wartime leader, wielding not just authority, but a kind of moral thunder. As the war dragged into its fourth year, Lincoln bore the burden with a visible toll. He grew thinner, grayer, his face etched by sleepless nights and the endless lists of dead and wounded. Every day he received letters from mothers and wives, each asking why their sons and husbands had died. He didn't fight on the front lines, but he carried the war's weight in his eyes and on his shoulders. And if you think today's workplace politics are brutal, consider Lincoln's cabinet. It was a collection of former rivals, men who'd once run against him and weren't shy about reminding him of it. Yet Lincoln managed them with a blend of patience, humor, and quiet authority. He didn't rule by fear or bluster. He told stories, listened carefully, and somehow bent the will of strong-willed men to his own. Even his harshest critics had to admit, beneath that gentle smile, the man was made of steel. Then came Gettysburg, in July 1863, when the war's horror reached its peak. 3 days of fighting left more than 50,000 men, dead, wounded, or missing. Months later, Lincoln traveled to Pennsylvania to dedicate a cemetery. He wasn't supposed to give the main speech, just a brief reflection. But in 272 words, he distilled the nation's pain and hope, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address wasn't flashy. It didn't thunder or boast. It was quiet, reverent, and timeless. It made clear that this war wasn't just about patching the Union back together. It was about redeeming the nation's soul, making it what it had always claimed to be. As the presidential election of 1864 approached, Lincoln faced opposition from every angle. The war dragged on, and even some in his own party wanted him gone. Many predicted he'd lose to George McClellan, the very general he had fired for excessive caution. But then, as the tide of war shifted, especially after General Sherman captured Atlanta, Lincoln's fortunes revived. He won re-election by a wide margin. Even then, Lincoln didn't gloat. "It is not in my nature to triumph over anyone," he said. The war was nearly over, but Lincoln understood that ending the fighting was just the beginning. Musket balls could save the Union, but it would take something far deeper, mercy, vision, and healing, to save its soul. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing like a house of cards in a rainstorm. Cities fell in rapid succession. Richmond, the Confederate capital, was in flames. General Robert E. Lee's army was starving, shrinking, and running out of options. Yet Lincoln felt no satisfaction in their defeat. For him, victory wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. In his second inaugural address on March 4, 1865, Lincoln stood before the nation and spoke like a father trying to keep a fractured family together. "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds." These weren't the words of a conqueror. They were the words of a man who'd seen too much pain and wanted only to heal. On April 9, Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was finally over. The Union had survived, and with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, slavery was finally abolished. For the first time, the nation took a trembling, imperfect step toward the ideals written into its founding documents. But just as the country started to breathe again, tragedy struck with cruel speed. 5 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln went to enjoy an evening at Ford's Theater in Washington, a rare moment of respite. In the middle of the play, actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box and shot Lincoln. The president died the next morning, April 15, 1865. The nation was stunned. Black Americans, many newly freed, wept openly in the streets. Even former Confederates acknowledged the depth of the loss. Lincoln had been their best chance for reconciliation, a man who never let hatred cloud his judgment, even toward those who tried to destroy him. Lincoln never lived to see the messy, painful process of Reconstruction. He didn't get to heal the wounds his presidency had exposed. But his death transformed him from a leader into a symbol, a lasting reminder of freedom, unity, and the painful price of moral progress. From a dirt-floored Kentucky cabin to the highest office in the land, Lincoln rose without wealth, privilege, or cruelty. He led the nation through its darkest night, not with blinding brilliance, but with a steady, stubborn light. That light, dimmed by an assassin's bullet, still flickers in the story of America. And as with all good boring history and sleep stories, it reminds us that ordinary people, thrust into extraordinary times, can change the course of the world. So, as we drift from the smoky air of Lincoln's America, full of muddy boots, telegrams at midnight, and the peculiar aroma of a country at war, let's take a gentle turn. Next up, we'll leave battlefields behind and peek into a world you probably don't picture when you hear the words ancient civilization. Because when we imagine the ancient world, we usually think of mighty empires, glittering temples, and epic battles. But what about what went on beneath the marble floors? Stay tuned, sleepy listeners, because the story of ancient toilets, drains, and the invention of not stepping in something unpleasant is about to begin. Picture this. You're drifting off to sleep, the kind of sleep that only comes after a long, boring history lesson. Maybe you're seeing ancient kings in golden chariots, priests chanting under marble pillars, and armies clashing beneath stormy skies. But let's be real. Nobody ever falls asleep fast by picturing ancient people on the toilet. Still, the truth is, while those kings and warriors were busy conquering and building, someone else had a much less glamorous job, figuring out where all that royal waste was supposed to go. And, believe it or not, the story of toilets might just be the most oddly soothing sleep story you'll hear tonight. Settle in, because tonight's broadcast is about to take a very practical turn. We're diving into the origins of sanitation, yes, the secret history of ancient plumbing. If you've ever grumbled about a clogged toilet or the horrors of a public restroom, just wait until you hear about communal latrines, sponges on sticks, and the sheer creativity of people who had nothing but bricks, water, and a stubborn sense of dignity. Let's begin with a question you never thought you'd hear on a sleep video. How did ancient people deal with their poop? Forget golden crowns and sacred rituals for a second, and imagine yourself in a world where the biggest technological leap is figuring out how not to step in yesterday's business on your way to breakfast. Sanitation wasn't just a matter of comfort. It was a matter of life and death. Human waste, left unchecked, can turn a thriving city into a petri dish for dysentery, cholera, or a dozen other invisible ailments that don't care how important you are. In a world without antibiotics or scented disinfectant sprays, the difference between a healthy city and a sick one often came down to how well folks managed their mess. Now, let's travel back about 4,500 years, long before the Romans were building aqueducts or the Greeks were dreaming up their public baths. Our first stop is the Indus Valley, around 2,600 years before the so-called Common Era. If you're imagining a dusty ruin, think again. The cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, which now lie in modern-day Pakistan, were marvels of order and design. The people here weren't just stacking bricks and calling it a day. They were laying out entire city blocks with laser-straight streets and, most impressively, covered drains that snaked beneath them. Yes, while much of the world was still digging a hole and calling it a toilet, the Indus Valley folks were quietly building one of history's first urban sanitation systems. And not just for the rich. Even modest homes had a small room set aside for washing, with a squat-style toilet or bathing area. Waste from these rooms would flow down vertical chutes, out into covered brick drains running along the streets. Those drains didn't just dump everything into a nearby ditch either. They connected to larger sewers, built with inspection holes and clever brickwork to catch solids. If you're picturing a high-tech modern sewer, slow down. These were simple, but the basics were all there. Some scholars think the well-off residents might have even used jars of water to flush their toilets, letting gravity do the dirty work. That's right, long before "just jiggle the handle" became a household phrase. The Indus Valley was experimenting with manual flushing, and the innovation didn't stop at toilets. They ran a parallel system for stormwater, keeping rain from flooding their homes or mixing with, well, less pleasant runoff. Public wells dotted the city, and while we can't say for sure how pure the water was, the very act of building sanitation into the city hints at a surprisingly modern concern for public health. But maybe the most remarkable thing about these cities isn't what they built, but what they didn't. No gigantic temples or palaces. No monuments to the gods. The Indus Valley people seem to have cared more about keeping things running smoothly and fairly than building for glory. Their toilets, practical and widely available, reflect a society that valued function and equality as much as spectacle. It's the kind of thing that would make a city planner weep with joy, and maybe even help you fall asleep fast, if you're the sort who likes your bedtime stories with a side of brickwork and drainage gradients. Of course, not everything about the Indus Valley is crystal clear. Their writing remains a mystery, and scholars are still puzzling over why these cities eventually faded away. But the buried channels and brick-lined drains still speak, quietly but insistently, about a civilization that put its faith in clean streets and public health. In the grand parade of weird history, the Indus Valley's toilets deserve far more applause than they usually get. Now, let's tune our sleepy radio dial to Egypt, where the Nile's annual flooding wasn't the only thing people had to manage. In ancient Egypt, cleanliness was less about engineering and more about ritual. Bathing wasn't just a way to get the sand out of your hair. It was a sacred duty. For the wealthy, homes came equipped with limestone basins or whole rooms designed for washing, with servants on hand to pour water over your head, rub you with perfumed oils, or scrub you with natron, a naturally occurring salt. Hair removal? Absolutely. If you want to imagine a pampered ancient Egyptian, think less dusty mummy and more spa day every day. But beneath all this ritual purity, there was a practical side. Toilets in Egypt ran the gamut from simple sand-lined pits to wooden or limestone seats perched over ceramic pots. These pots would be discreetly emptied by servants or slaves, ideally somewhere far away from the house, preferably out in the desert, where the pharaohs couldn't smell it. In the homes of the wealthy, toilet seats might be hidden away in private quarters, a quiet sign that status and sanitation were becoming intertwined. If you were living in the city, though, things were a bit less refined. Public sanitation didn't really exist. The streets of Thebes or Memphis could be, let's say, fragrant on a hot day. Waste sometimes ended up used as fertilizer in the countryside, but in the bustling cities, it often just piled up or ran into the nearest water source. Still, the real obsession was personal cleanliness, not public hygiene. Priests, for example, had to bathe several times daily, shave their heads and bodies, and avoid anything impure. They couldn't set foot in a temple without ritual washing, which sometimes included enemas, not for medicine, but as a spiritual reset. If you're wondering how that fits into your relaxing sleep stories, let's just say that ancient ideas about cleanliness could be very thorough. There's even evidence that Egyptians took their toilet habits into the afterlife. Archaeologists have found toilet stools among the grave goods of pharaohs and nobles. Apparently, even on the far side of the river Styx, nobody wanted to be caught without a proper seat or a little privacy. And if you thought pest control was a modern obsession, think again. The Egyptians used amulets, spells, and all sorts of ointments to keep flies and other disease spreaders at bay. Cleanliness, in their world, was a blend of magic and good sense. To sum it up, Egypt may not have engineered vast sewer systems, but it pioneered an attitude toward hygiene that shaped its medicine, religion, and everyday routines. Their toilets might have been simple, but their understanding of purity and health was anything but. Now, if you're still with me, eyes getting heavy, mind wandering, let's take one last detour before the Romans crash the party. We're off to Bronze Age Crete, home of the Minoans. If you're picturing a bunch of folks squatting over holes in the ground, think again. The Minoans, who flourished over 3,500 years ago, had indoor plumbing that would put some modern homes to shame. Their capital, Knossos, is famous for its labyrinth and its mythic minotaur. But the real marvel might just be the plumbing beneath your feet. These people understood something that would befuddle the rest of the world for centuries: gravity and water pressure. Their palaces had terracotta pipes running under floors and inside walls, channeling rainwater and spring water into fountains, baths, and, yes, toilets. In the Queen's Megaron at Knossos, archaeologists uncovered what might be the world's oldest known flush toilet, a wooden seat above a stone basin, all connected to a vertical pipe. How do you flush? Just pour a jug of water down the pipe and let nature do the rest. Bathing was big here too. The Minoans built enormous ceramic bathtubs, the kind you can picture in a modern bathroom, and supplied them with water from rooftop tanks or miniature aqueducts. Used water drained away through underground channels, and some historians believe they even experimented with U-shaped water traps to block odors from wafting back up, sort of a Bronze Age version of the S-bend under your kitchen sink. But here's where the Minoans get truly stylish. Unlike later civilizations, whose public latrines were social hubs for gossip and awkward eye contact, Minoan toilets were usually private, tucked away in individual homes. It's the sort of comfort that wouldn't become common in Europe until well into the 1800s. And they weren't content with basic functionality either. Their bathrooms were decked out in colorful frescoes and elegant plasterwork. Sanitation, for the Minoans, could be both practical and beautiful. Sadly, all good things come to an end. Around 1450 before the Common Era, the Minoan civilization vanished, maybe due to volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, or invasions. Their innovations in plumbing disappeared with them, and the world would have to wait 1,000 years or more for indoor toilets to make a comeback. But the ruins of Knossos still whisper a simple, universal truth: the desire for privacy, cleanliness, and a good soak in the tub is as old as civilization itself. So, as you drift further towards sleep, remember this: the story of civilization isn't just told in crowns and conquests. Sometimes the best stories for sleep, the weird history, The real bedtime stories are buried in pipes and brick drains, in the quiet genius of people who just wanted to keep things clean. It's a side of history that's a little bit boring, a little bit gross, and, if you ask me, just perfect for late-night radio and learning history while you sleep. And speaking of people who took sanitation to the next level, let's set the dial for Rome. Because when it comes to ancient sanitation, no civilization made a bigger, bolder statement than the Romans. Stay tuned as we wade into the marble halls and public baths of Rome, where hygiene became a matter of public spectacle and private virtue. Tonight, we're in the heart of ancient Rome, where the air is thick with the scent of olive oil, ambition, and, let's be honest, a certain earthy aroma that no amount of incense can quite cover up. If you're drifting off to one of those sleep stories or boring history for sleep segments, you're in just the right place. Because when it comes to sanitation, Rome didn't just dabble. They went for the full public spectacle. Forget everything you know about private bathrooms and quiet time. In the Roman Empire, going to the toilet was a group activity, a kind of civic gathering with a side of questionable hygiene. Picture yourself stepping into a bustling Roman city, maybe Pompeii or Londinium, and stumbling upon a public latrine. There's no gentle knock on a stall door here, no polite cough to signal you're not alone. Instead, you walk into a broad, echoing stone room lined with long benches. Each bench is punctuated by a neat series of holes, spaced just far enough apart for a little elbow-to-elbow camaraderie. No privacy walls, no shame. Just you and your fellow citizens, sitting shoulder to shoulder, handling life's necessities together. Beneath those benches, you'd hear the constant trickle of water, part of an ingenious channel system designed to sweep away waste. The Romans, never ones to shy away from innovation, set up a second channel as well. This one for rinsing what might be the most notorious invention in the annals of weird history, the communal sponge stick, or torsorium. Imagine a sea sponge mounted on a stick, dunked in water and vinegar, and passed from hand to hand. Yes, it was reused. Hygienic? Not exactly. Efficient? Absolutely. In a city that ran on routines, there wasn't time for everyone to have their own roll of toilet paper, and besides, the trees had enough to worry about. But here's the thing. Roman toilets weren't just about the plumbing. They were about community. While modern folks are all about their privacy, the Romans turned the latrine into a social hub. People swapped gossip, conducted business deals, and probably debated the finer points of gladiator fashion, all while perched on those chilly stone benches. It's the ancient world's answer to the modern water cooler, just with a little more ambiance. And if you think the decor was lacking, think again. Roman latrines were often decorated with vibrant mosaics and witty inscriptions. Some of the earliest examples of toilet humor, literally, can be found scrawled on the walls of Pompeii's public toilets. Complaints about the smell? Of course. Jokes about the plumbing? Naturally. There are even ancient notes left by users grumbling about the guy who didn't rinse the sponge properly. If you listen closely, you can almost hear a Roman senator muttering, "Some things never change." The Roman passion for sanitation didn't stop at the latrine door. Their cities were laced with an intricate network of sewers called cloacae. The most famous of these, the Cloaca Maxima in Rome, began as a way to drain marshland, but soon transformed into the backbone of the city's waste disposal operation. Rainwater, urine, filth, all of it swept away in a system that, in some places, rivaled the efficiency of a 19th century metropolis. Wealthier Romans enjoyed the privilege of indoor toilets, little stone seats tucked into the corners of their homes, emptying into cesspits or straight into the city's sewer lines. The poor, not so lucky, relied on chamber pots, essentially ancient portable toilets that sometimes, despite city ordinances, ended up dumped out the window into the street below. Consider it the original version of out of sight, out of mind. Though the unlucky folks walking beneath those windows might beg to differ. If you found yourself living in a Roman apartment building, or insula, you'd quickly learn that plumbing was not standard issue. Many units had no toilets at all, and the lower floors were often plagued by rising sewage from the street. If you're trying to fall asleep fast, just imagine drifting off to the gentle sound of water. Only it's not rain, it's the neighbor's chamber pot. And because this is Rome, of course they managed to turn even urine into a taxable commodity. That's right, Emperor Vespasian imposed a urine tax, most infamously on public urinals. The story goes that his fiscal creativity was so legendary, urinals in France and Italy are still nicknamed after him. Just think, next time you grumble about parking fees, remember the Romans paid to pee. What stands out most about Roman sanitation isn't just the technology, it's the attitude. Toilets were open, noisy, democratic, and, in their own way, progressive. The Romans made public hygiene a matter of public pride, or at least public routine, a kind of civic duty on par with voting or attending the games. It was the world's first large-scale experiment in communal sanitation, and for better or worse, everyone got a seat at the table. Now, if you wandered across the Mediterranean to ancient Greece, you'd find a culture with a very different take on bodily business. The Greeks were the inventors of democracy, drama, and philosophy, but when it came to sanitation, they preferred a little decorum. To them, using the toilet was a private affair, not something to be shared with friends or the local senator. In your average Greek home, the toilet was a simple arrangement, a clay pot or a stone seat perched over a pit. No rushing water, no clever sponge sticks, and definitely no mosaics. Waste collection was, let's just say, hands-on. Usually it was up to slaves to empty out the cesspits, hauling the contents to disposal sites, or dumping them on the outskirts of town. If you lived in a city, you might see open drains running down the streets, sometimes carrying away rainwater, sometimes something a bit less pleasant. As cities grew, so did the smell, a problem that was often ignored in favor of more philosophical pursuits. But if Greek toilets were basic, their baths were anything but. Gymnasia, public exercise areas where, yes, everyone was naked, were almost always attached to bathhouses. These weren't just places to get clean. They were the social heart of the city, where men gathered to debate politics, exchange poetry, and maybe sneak in a little people watching. Unlike the marble palaces of Roman bathing, Greek baths were usually simple, circular tubs or shallow pools with cold water the order of the day. No steamy caldarium, no scented oils, just a brisk rub down and back to business. Water was precious, and the Greeks engineered clever aqueducts and pipes to keep their cities supplied. Athens, for example, boasted an agora with one of the earliest public latrines, stone seats, and a rudimentary drainage system. But even here, public toilets were rare. The Greeks just couldn't bring themselves to make defecation a group activity. Instead, they pursued another kind of cleanliness, the philosophical sort. Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, was one of the first thinkers to connect dirt and disease. He argued that filthy air and water could cause illness, a radical claim in a world where most people thought disease was punishment from the gods. His advice for clean air, fresh water, and dry homes would eventually shape Roman city planning and even modern public health. For the Greeks, sanitation was about discipline, not infrastructure. A clean body reflected a clean mind and a virtuous soul. Bodily filth was more than just a nuisance. It was a threat to moral order. Their latrines may have been primitive, but their obsession with purity and self-control would echo through the centuries. Meanwhile, across the vast landscapes of ancient China, sanitation took on yet another form, blending practicality with philosophy in a way only the Chinese could manage. Here, cleanliness wasn't just about keeping disease at bay. It was tied to cosmic balance and social order, a dance of harmony that played out in the most mundane corners of daily life. Most Chinese homes didn't have anything close to a modern toilet. Instead, people relied on chamber pots, portable containers made of ceramic or bronze, ranging from simple to ornate, depending on your social standing. After use, these pots were emptied into larger household cesspits or carried beyond the city walls by servants or family members. In rural areas, human waste, known as night soil, was often saved as fertilizer, a practice that, strange as it sounds, would go on for centuries and help sustain China's agricultural might. Larger cities, like Chang'an and Luoyang, built communal toilets, basic pits or troughs with wooden platforms for sitting or squatting. Some even offered privacy screens, a courtesy the Romans rarely bothered with. Waste from these public facilities was collected and repurposed for farming, a system that kept the cities relatively clean by ancient standards, though not without its dangers. If you ever wondered how to learn history while you sleep, just imagine drifting off in a city kept tidy by a small army of night soil collectors. And here's a curious footnote for your next trivia night. The oldest known toilet paper may have originated in China. By the 2nd century before our era, people were using scraps of soft paper, often leftover writings, to clean up. By the 6th century, there's written evidence of paper being made specifically for bathroom use. The rich preferred silk remnants or polished bamboo spatulas, which were cleaned and reused with a kind of stoic resignation. Yes, even in matters of hygiene, the Chinese found a way to balance elegance and utility. Cleanliness in China wasn't just a physical chore. It was a spiritual calling. Confucian ideals stressed order and respect, while Taoist beliefs wove cleanliness into rituals of purity and cosmic harmony. Excrement was considered a pollutant, something to be dealt with quickly and never mentioned in polite conversation. In the imperial court, the business of waste was so secretive that eunuchs were assigned to manage it discreetly, ensuring that not even the emperor had to think about such earthly matters. Despite a lack of sprawling underground sewers, ancient Chinese cities stayed impressively clean, thanks to strict taboos, cultural discipline, and a well-organized system of waste collection. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. Through chamber pots, composting, and the world's earliest bathroom paper, the Chinese charted a path to sanitation that was humble, effective, and deeply rooted in tradition. Now, if you're picturing the Vikings as unwashed brutes, think again. Sure, they were busy raiding, feuding, and inventing the world's first proto-raincoat, but the Norse took their hygiene surprisingly seriously. Archaeologists digging beneath the old streets of Jorvik, modern-day York, and Hedeby have found the remains of thoughtfully constructed latrine pits lined with timber or stone. These were not just random holes in the ground, but functional toilets used by both individuals and families. The Norse, ever practical, often dug their latrines just a short stroll from their homes. They even built little wooden shelters to shield themselves from the Arctic wind, because nobody wants to bear their backside to a blizzard. Waste from these pits, an aromatic blend of human leavings, food scraps, and animal bits, was sometimes composted, sometimes just left to nature's devices. In some settlements, pits were cleaned and reused. In others, a fresh pit was dug as needed. Vikings didn't invent the flush, but they knew how to keep things manageable. Inside the smoky longhouses, chamber pots and buckets stood ready for those frigid winter nights when stepping outside was a non-starter. These were then emptied into the latrine pits or onto dung heaps outside the settlement. It might not sound glamorous, but compared to the habit in medieval cities of tossing waste out the window, it was downright progressive. If you ever find yourself wishing for a sleep video to escape modern worries, just remember, the Vikings had to contend with frozen chamber pots and the ever-present risk of stepping in something unpleasant. Hygiene for the Vikings was as much about status as survival. They bathed regularly, by Norse standards at least, usually once a week on what the English would later call washing day or Saturday. Archaeologists regularly turn up combs, tweezers, and ear cleaners carved from bone or antler, a testament to the Viking pride in personal grooming. Cleanliness mattered, not just to keep the lice at bay, but to look presentable when negotiating a marriage alliance or haggling over a sheep. So, while the Vikings never built grand sewers or invented toilet paper, they kept themselves and their settlements reasonably clean. It was all about blunt efficiency. Dig a pit, wash when you can, and don't let waste pile up near your longhouse. It's the kind of approach you'd expect from people who made their living braving the North Sea and sleeping beside their livestock. No fuss, just survival. And if you zoom out for a moment, you'll see this pattern repeating across civilizations and centuries. Every society, from Rome's marble latrines to the Vikings' timber pits, faced the same basic problem: how to keep people and their waste apart. The solutions varied: aqueducts and sewers in Rome, chamber pots and composting in China, a little Norse pragmatism in Scandinavia. But the goal was always the same: prevent disease, keep the peace, and preserve some sense of dignity, even if it meant sharing a sponge stick with your neighbor. What's fascinating, and just a little bit ironic, is how much ancient wisdom about sanitation fell through the cracks of history. After Rome's fall, Europe's grand sewer systems decayed, public toilets vanished, and open streets became rivers of filth. It would take centuries, and a few rounds of plague for city planners to rediscover what the ancients already knew. Yet their legacy lingers. The word latrine comes straight from Latin. The flush toilet owes a distant debt to Minoan gravity systems. And that roll of paper in your bathroom, 1,000-year-old Chinese innovation recycled for modern comfort. Sanitation doesn't get the glory of a monument or the romance of a bedtime story. But let's face it, without it, civilization collapses. It's the background music to every great city, the unsung hero of human progress. So, next time you enjoy the solitude and plumbing of a modern bathroom, give a little nod to the Romans, Greeks, Chinese, and Vikings who paved the way, sometimes literally, so that you wouldn't have to worry about what's flowing under your street. And with that, as you settle in and maybe ponder your own midnight trip down the hall, let's turn the dial from the world of waste management to a different kind of mapping. The mental blueprints that shaped how people understood their world long before Google Maps, before satellites, compasses, or even writing, humans had an instinct to map. But how did those first maps take shape? And what can they tell us about the dreams and fears of ancient peoples? Stay tuned, because our next chapter is all about the origins of mapping. And trust me, it's more interesting than you'd think, especially if you're listening in the dark, waiting for sleep to claim you. Let's set the mood. It's late. You're half tucked under your blanket, and your mind is wandering through that strange twilight zone between sleep and waking. Maybe you've got one ear tuned to the soft hum of your old radio, and there I am, your ever-curious, slightly jaded host, ready to guide you through tonight's installment of boring history for sleep. Don't worry, there's no test at the end, just stories, strange details, and, if you're lucky, a few yawns along the way. So, let's drift back in time, further than the dustiest old library shelf, back before anyone had even heard of a GPS or a subway map, before writing, before compasses, even before the idea of putting pen to parchment. People had a burning urge to figure out where they were, not just so they could find the nearest restroom. Though, let's be honest, that's always been a universal concern. But to make sense of the endless, intimidating world around them. A map, in those days, wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. It was a story, a survival guide, something woven from hopes, fears, and the ever-present sense that the universe was vast and occasionally out to get you. Imagine the first maps, not rolled-up scrolls or fancy atlases, but crude outlines scratched onto bone, etched into rock, or murmured from memory around smoky fires. Think of Paleolithic carvings, some over 14,000 years old, showing clusters of animals, winding rivers, and maybe even a few stick-figure huts. Were these maps in the way we think of maps today? Not quite. But they were a start, a way of connecting movement and meaning, turning the world into something a little less overwhelming. As people started forming communities and the first glimmers of civilization flickered to life, the urge to map things got stronger. Trade routes began to snake across mountains and deserts. Suddenly, a good map wasn't just a fun pastime for the village artist, it was a lifeline. Merchants needed to know which river led to friendly faces and which path ended with a "Here be bandits" sign. Kings, meanwhile, realized that drawing a line on a map was a great way to pretend they owned everything inside it, at least until the next king came along with a slightly bigger army and a different colored pen. But if you're picturing ancient maps as neat, accurate layouts, forget it. These were not Google Earth. Ancient maps were gloriously, unapologetically distorted. What mattered was meaning, not measurement. The most important place in the world, their own city, their sacred mountain, their favorite kebab stall, always sat smack in the center. Everything else warped and wobbled around it, growing or shrinking based on legend, fear, or the latest rumor from a guy who swore he'd seen the edge of the world and lived to tell about it. And sometimes the unknown corners of these maps sprouted griffins, giant ants, or the ever-popular dragons. Why leave a space blank when you could fill it with a monster or two? It's the ancient equivalent of no signal on your phone, except with more teeth. Now, not every culture even bothered with flat visual maps. Take the Polynesian navigators, who were basically the Jedi masters of the open ocean. Instead of drawing, they built stick charts, tangled webs of coconut fiber and shells, recording the patterns of waves and the positions of islands. These weren't for casual reading. You learned to feel a stick chart, to memorize its secrets with your hands, your mind, and years of training. It wasn't just a guide. It was a rite of passage, a way of becoming one with the sea, or at least not getting hopelessly lost on the way to your cousin's island wedding. So, why this obsession with mapping? It's a deeply human thing. To stand in the middle of nowhere and think, where am I, really? Whether you're carving a river into clay, painting a line on a wall, or humming a tune that describes the path home, you're doing what humans have always done, trying to find your place in a world that never stands still. Tonight, let's drop anchor in Mesopotamia, where the Babylonians took mapping to a whole new level. Picture the ancient city of Babylon, all baked brick and ziggurats surrounded by rivers, and the kind of relentless heat that makes you grateful for even the worst modern air conditioning. Here, the first known maps were pressed into clay tablets, cosmic blueprints as much as practical guides. The most famous of these is the Imago Mundi, dating from the 6th century before the Common Era. Imagine holding a piece of clay no bigger than your hand, peering down at a tiny rectangle labeled Babylon, surrounded by a circle representing the known world. The Euphrates River snakes across the middle, while cities, regions, and even mountains are marked out in neat, wedge-shaped cuneiform. Beyond that circle flows a bitter river, which historians think was their version of the ocean. And past that, mysterious triangles, each with a description that sounds suspiciously like, "Don't go there, trust us." These were the zones of chaos, the ancient equivalent of the "Here be dragons" sticker slapped on the edge of the family minivan. But for the Babylonians, mapping wasn't just about land. The night sky was just as important. Babylonian astronomers who, frankly, had more patience than most of us can imagine, tracked the movements of planets, the phases of the moon, and the dance of eclipses. They inscribed their findings on clay tablets, which served both as scientific logs and as horoscopes for predicting the future. The map of the sky wasn't just a tool, it was a window into fate itself. Meanwhile, down on Earth, the Babylonians were practical people. They needed to keep track of which field belonged to which farmer, especially when taxes and irrigation were on the line. Clay tablets from as early as 2300, before the Common Era, showed detailed surveys of farmland, marking boundaries, irrigation ditches, and who owed what to whom. Precision was crucial, not for navigation in the modern sense, but to keep the wheels of bureaucracy turning and the priests and tax collectors happy. You can see it in every map they made, a constant tug-of-war between order and chaos, between the world you can measure and the world you invent after one too many sleepless nights. For the Babylonians, mapping was a way to shrink the unknown and to put themselves, quite literally, at the center of everything. If Babylonian maps were cosmic and mythic, the ancient Egyptians were more down to earth, literally. In Egypt, the world was defined by the floodplains of the Nile, a river with a habit of wiping the slate clean every year. Imagine being a royal surveyor, waking up after another night in a smoky hut, only to find that the river had erased every boundary marker you set out the previous season. Mapping here was an annual exercise in patience, precision, and probably a fair bit of grumbling. Egyptian surveyors, known as the rope stretchers, used cords, rods, and sighting tools to redraw property lines, calculate taxes, and keep the peace between farmers who'd had just about enough of their neighbors' goats. This wasn't a job for dreamers. It was state business, tightly controlled by temple scribes and royal officials who understood that land meant power. Some Egyptian maps survive today, and they're surprisingly pragmatic. Take the Turin papyrus map, dating back to around 1160 before the Common Era. It's not a grand vision of the cosmos. It's a working diagram of hills, wadis, roads, and gold mines in the eastern desert. Streams snake across the parchment. Quarries and mineral deposits are marked with scribbled notes for the crews sent out to dig, not for display in the pharaoh's living room. Yet, even in this world of bureaucracy and back-breaking labor, the Egyptians didn't forget the sacred. Temples and cities were laid out according to cosmic principles, pyramids aligned with the stars. The act of mapping was an expression of ma'at, the principle of order and harmony. Even in death, the Egyptians mapped the underworld. The Book of the Dead and the Amduat are filled with elaborate diagrams, guiding souls through 12 hours of night, past serpents, gates, and gods with suspiciously animal heads. These weren't maps you could fold up and stick in your tunic, but they were essential for navigating eternity. So, if you're drifting off, let this thought carry you. Every scratch in the rock, every mark on clay, every tangled web of sticks and shells was a way for someone, somewhere, to make the world just a bit less confusing, to find a path home, to keep the neighbors from stealing their cabbages, or maybe just to convince themselves that chaos could be conquered, at least until the next flood. And as we leave the Egyptians measuring their fields by starlight, and the Babylonians mapping myth and mud, we move into a new era. One where maps become not just tools, but weapons, scientific instruments, and claims of empire. The Greeks didn't invent maps, but they revolutionized how maps were thought about. So, fluff your pillow, settle in, and let's chart a course through the next chapter of cartographic invention. Let's drift back to a time when the world was mostly unknown, when the edges of the map weren't just blank, but whispered with stories of monsters and mystery. Tonight, On our ongoing late-night journey through boring history and weird history, we're heading into the strange, surprisingly gripping world of ancient map-making. So, if you're hoping to fall asleep fast, or just want a sleep story that features philosophers, emperors, and a few confused goats along the way, you're in good company. I promise. The only monsters lurking here are bureaucratic ones. Now, the Greeks. They didn't invent the map, but they took the humble act of drawing lines on a surface and turned it into something a bit like magic. Before them, most folks thought of space in terms of landmarks, not coordinates. The big tree by the river, turn left at the boulder that looks like a sheep, pray you don't get lost, that sort of thing. The Greeks, though, started to measure, calculate, and, perhaps most offensively to their neighbors, reason. Geography became an intellectual playground, not just a practical tool for telling your cousin how to cross the mountains without dying of exposure or boredom. One of the earliest players in this game was Anaximander, a philosopher from Miletus around the 6th century BCE. Picture him, probably squinting at the horizon and wondering if anyone would ever invent sunglasses. He's credited with drawing one of the first real conceptual maps of the world. Sadly, the original is gone, presumably recycled into something more immediately useful, like a hat or a tablecloth. But ancient sources describe his map as a disc. Imagine a pizza with the Mediterranean as the gooey cheese in the middle, and slices of Europe and Asia radiating around it. It wasn't meant for navigation, really. It was a statement. Look, the world isn't just a myth. I can draw it. It marked a break with those older, myth-soaked maps, where the edges were home to gods, giants, and probably at least one enormous chicken. Then along comes Hecataeus, who took the torch from Anaximander and ran with it, probably tripping over a few rocks on the way. He refined those early maps and, much like someone live tweeting their gap year, wrote a detailed account of his travels. His text, called the Periagesis, described lands, customs, and peoples, basically the world's earliest travel blog, minus the selfies and sponsored posts for ancient sandal brands. But if you really want to talk about changing the game, you have to mention Claudius Ptolemy. Centuries after Anaximander, Ptolemy made Greek map-making into a science. His geography, written in the 2nd century CE, was less a book and more of a user manual for the planet. It included detailed instructions for making maps, a database of over 8,000 place names, and, get this, a grid system of latitude and longitude. All this centuries before anyone dreamed of GPS or even a halfway decent road sign. Ptolemy even tackled the classic headache of how to draw a round Earth on a flat piece of papyrus. Map projections, the ancient world's answer to, why does Greenland look so weird? They're still giving geography students nightmares to this day. Greek maps weren't just practical, though. They were windows into how the Greeks wanted to see themselves. The oikumene, or inhabited world, was surrounded by vast oceans and mysterious lands, conveniently labeled as the homes of barbarians and oddities. Greece, unsurprisingly, sat right at the center, like that one friend who always organizes the group chat around their schedule. The further you got from home, the wobblier the geography became. It's a bit like drawing your hometown in crisp detail and then just sort of scribbling mountains, forests, and here be dragons anywhere else. Greek thinkers didn't just draw maps. They argued about the planet's shape. Some, like Eratosthenes, a man who really put the math in bath, calculated Earth's circumference using nothing more than shadows, geometry, and a stick. Picture him, standing in Alexandria in the blazing sun, staring at the shadow cast by a pillar and thinking, "If I get this wrong, I'll be the laughingstock of the library." He was impressively accurate, off by only a few hundred miles. No small feat in an age when the average person's idea of distance was, "How long before my sandals disintegrate?" In the end, Greek cartography was about more than just drawing lines. It was about decoding the planet's shape and size and putting humanity on the map, sometimes literally, sometimes with a dash of ego. Now, if the Greeks gave us map-making as a science, the Romans took those ideas and ran them through the imperial bureaucracy. Roman power wasn't just about legions marching in formation or emperors giving dramatic speeches from marble balconies. It was about logistics. And nothing says logistics quite like a map with every road, tax district, and sheep pasture meticulously noted. The Roman Empire was held together by an absurdly large and well-maintained road network. You've heard the phrase, "All roads lead to Rome." For the Romans, that was less a metaphor and more of a project deadline. Their maps weren't about the cosmos or the heavens. They were about how to get from here to there, with as few surprises as possible, unless you count the surprise of being robbed by bandits or running out of wine. Take the Tabula Peutingeriana, for example, a 4th century CE copy of what was probably the world's most ambitious road map. And I use the word map loosely. Spatial accuracy? Forget it. This thing stretches the Mediterranean like a piece of taffy. Land masses are elongated, squished, and sometimes just tossed onto the parchment wherever there was space. But that wasn't the point. The tabula shows routes, way stations, distances, and connections. It was a tool for getting things done, not for pondering your place in the cosmos. If you've ever looked at a subway map and wondered why the city looks like it was designed by a committee of sleep-deprived cats, you're catching the Roman vibe. The clarity of movement mattered more than representing the terrain. Every few miles you'd find a mansio, a little rest stop for changing horses, grabbing a bite to eat, and, if you were lucky, finding a bed that didn't double as a flea circus. These maps gave Roman generals, merchants, and messengers the superpower of predictability. They knew where to rest, where to resupply, and how long it would take to reach the next town. The empire was navigable not just by hoof and sandal, but by ink and parchment. In a way, Roman mapping turned the chaos of a sprawling empire into something almost manageable. The map was a spreadsheet with roads. Just imagine the world's most confusing Excel file. Only the formulas are in Latin, and half the cells are wine stains. The Romans didn't just map roads, though. They were obsessed with who owned what. Enter the cadastral map, a highly detailed record of land boundaries, ownership, and taxes. Some of these were even engraved on bronze and posted in public spaces, so everyone could see exactly which senator owned which sheep-filled field. Control of land was control of power, and the Romans understood that with a kind of ruthless clarity. If you wanted to argue about a property line, you didn't just squabble with your neighbor. You squabbled with the imperial record. Interestingly, the Romans didn't really care about mapping the globe or the stars. Their maps rarely strayed into the philosophical. Theirs was a world of concrete, not constellations, of boundaries, not the beyond. Their mapping style was all about efficiency, administration, and sometimes the soul-crushing boredom of paperwork. But while Rome was busy paving and taxing its way across continents, the ancient Chinese were mapping with an entirely different philosophy in mind. In China, a map was never just a map. It was a statement about power, the cosmos, and the divine right to rule. To map the land was to understand your place under heaven and to keep your grip on the throne. Some of the oldest maps we know from China date back to the 4th century BCE. Archaeologists found them tucked away in tombs, like the ones at Mawangdui. These weren't meant for the living. They were buried with the dead, perhaps to guide the spirit on its journey, or to show off the deceased's territorial command in the afterlife. Picture a silk map, painted with rivers, roads, and military outposts. Not to scale, not for tourists, but incredibly rich in detail. If you ever wanted your ghost to avoid a traffic jam in the spirit world, this was the way to do it. By the Han Dynasty, which spanned from 2006 BCE to 2000 CCE, Chinese cartography had become both art and science. Officials used maps to govern vast provinces, keep track of taxes, and plan military campaigns. Surveying tools like the gnomon and sighting instruments allowed them to measure land with a surprising degree of accuracy. Some Han-era maps even included coordinate grids, centuries before anyone in Europe thought to do the same. One of the great pioneers of Chinese mapping was Pei Xiu, sometimes called the father of Chinese cartography. Working in the 3rd century CE, he developed principles for map-making that emphasized scale, direction, and consistency. You could say he brought a bit of order to a world that often felt pretty chaotic. His influence would ripple through Chinese and Korean mapping traditions for centuries. But Chinese maps gazed upward as well. Cosmological charts were a big deal. Star maps that grouped constellations into celestial palaces and mythical animals. The azure dragon of the east, the white tiger of the west. If you're picturing Hogwarts house banners, you're not far off. These star charts did more than predict the harvest. They underpinned imperial rituals and justified the emperor's rule. The Son of Heaven, as the emperor was called, had to govern in alignment with the celestial order. If his maps, or his sense of direction, fell out of sync with the stars, so did his mandate to rule. So, in China, a map wasn't just a bureaucratic tool. It was a bridge between the physical world and the cosmic order. Whether painted on silk, carved in stone, or etched in bronze, a map reflected the emperor's ability to bring order to chaos, to make the world and the heavens legible. Tonight's sleep story, then, is one of maps as power, science, and empire. Whether you're measuring shadows in Alexandria, plotting roads to Rome, or mapping the stars above the Middle Kingdom, one thing's clear. Survival wasn't just about knowing where you were. It was about knowing where you belonged. And with that, as the parchment curls and the empire's roads fade into the dusk, let's steer our attention to a different kind of map. Far from the massive empires of Eurasia, the Polynesians developed one of the most unique and abstract forms of mapping the world. Their way of navigating wasn't about roads or borders. It was about reading the waves and the stars. Pull up your blanket, settle in, and let's drift into the next chapter of Stories for Sleep, where the map is made not of ink, but of memory and the open sea. If you're still tuned in, welcome back to the Midnight Map Club, where the only thing more mysterious than the static on the airwaves is how anyone managed to find their way home before GPS. Tonight, we'll leave behind the grand stone capitals of Europe and Asia and journey into the wide Pacific, where the Polynesians quietly redefined what it meant to map a world without a single scroll, compass, or ink-stained finger in sight. Imagine this. You're standing on a sandy atoll in the Marshall Islands, the surf humming like a lullaby in the background. Instead of a dusty parchment, you're handed a curious object made of slender coconut fronds lashed together, the kind of thing modern art critics would probably call transformative, and everyone else might mistake for a broken fence. This is a stick chart, and for the Polynesian navigators, it was as essential as any map etched in stone or drawn on animal skin. Now, these weren't maps in the Western sense. No neat grids, no convenient. You are here. Arrows. Instead, every stick and curve stood for something you could only know by being out on the water. Ocean swells rolling in predictable rhythms, the subtle bounce of a wave around an island, the flight of a seabird hinting at land just over the horizon. Little shells or knots marked the islands. But the real magic was in the arrangement of the sticks, which captured the secret language of the sea. If you've ever tried to fold a road map in the wind, you'll appreciate that these didn't need folding at all. They were tactile, built to be traced with your fingers and memorized by touch. There were different kinds of these charts, each with its own quirks. Some, called rebel charts, covered entire chains of islands, like a subway map for the world's largest ocean. Others, called meadow charts, focused on smaller regions or single journeys. And then there were the matang charts, abstract, almost philosophical teaching tools, meant to explain how waves behaved near the islands. These weren't crammed into a canoe with the dried fish and the family pig. Instead, they were studied on shore, committed to memory, then left behind. A true Polynesian navigator would set out across hundreds of miles of open water with nothing but their senses and what they'd absorbed from these stick charts. If you're picturing a bunch of sailors arguing over directions while clutching a piece of driftwood, let's set the record straight. To the uninitiated, these charts might look like a toddler's failed craft project. But to a wayfinder, they were a living record, equal parts science experiment, family heirloom, and spiritual guide. This was geography, stripped of ego and conquest, built on humility before nature and a willingness to learn its patterns, not just measure its distances. And here's where things get interesting for our weird history and boring history for sleep. Crowd. Polynesian cartography didn't care about being literal or even visible. It was about feeling your way through space, not just seeing it on a piece of paper. The maps themselves blurred the boundaries between practical science and something closer to sacred ritual. They were passed down through oral tradition, protected by navigation schools, and regarded with the kind of reverence most of us reserve for secret family recipes or the Wi-Fi password. Out there, where the horizon could swallow you whole, These stick charts weren't just about getting from point A to point B. They were about surviving, belonging, and honoring the wisdom of ancestors who had crossed those same waters before. In the endless blue, the map was as much inside your head as in your hand. Shift the dial now to medieval Europe, and you'll find that maps started to look very different. Less, how do I get there? And more, what does it all mean? This was the age of symbolism, when the world on parchment was squeezed and stretched to fit the spirit, not the shape, of things. The most famous example, the TO map, which looks a bit like a pizza cut into 3 slices if you're feeling peckish at midnight. The TO map divided the world into 3, Asia at the top, Europe on the lower left, and Africa on the lower right, all encircled by the cosmic O of the ocean. Jerusalem, naturally, sat right at the center, radiating spiritual light, or perhaps just a lot of foot traffic. East was always at the top, pointing toward the Garden of Eden, because, if you're mapping out paradise, why not put it where the sun rises? These weren't your trusty navigation aids. In fact, using one to find your way would be about as effective as using a pizza box to chart the subway. Instead, these were teaching tools, sermons in ink, reminding everyone that the world made sense only through the lens of faith. Regions and peoples were labeled according to biblical lineages, and the further you moved from Jerusalem, the weirder things got. The margins teemed with headless men, dog-faced tribes, and people with feet so big they could use them as sun umbrellas. It's like the original, "Here be monsters," if your idea of a monster is someone with a really flexible yoga practice. But medieval map-making wasn't all fantasy and fire-breathing beasts. Over in Sicily, a Norman king commissioned a world map from the renowned Arab geographer al-Idrisi. The result, known as the Tabula Rogeriana, was a silver masterpiece, practical, detailed, and refreshingly empirical. Instead of monsters, it featured what travelers, traders, and sailors actually saw and heard, stitched together from interviews that spanned the Muslim and Christian worlds. The map even put south at the top, a subtle nod to the Islamic tradition, and possibly a way to keep Northern Europeans on their toes. And let's not forget the other world views spinning out their own cosmic blueprints. Jewish, Indian, and Buddhist traditions created maps that weren't about finding the next market or avoiding traffic jams, but about showing the metaphysical structure of existence. In India and Tibet, Mount Meru stood at the cosmic center, surrounded by mythical continents and divine realms, a kind of spiritual Google Earth with a lot more enlightenment and a lot fewer data breaches. All these medieval maps remind us of something we tend to forget when we're grumbling about the latest app update. Mapping isn't just about knowing where you are. It's about what you think the world is and what you believe matters most. In a time when every faraway shore promised both terror and wonder, the map wasn't just a guide. It was a mirror, reflecting the hopes, fears, and dreams of its makers. As the centuries rolled on, the urge to map only grew stronger. Humanity's curiosity swelled to match the size of the world in our minds. We mapped not just to get somewhere, but to understand who we were and what surrounded us. The earliest Babylonian maps weren't designed for lost tourists. They charted the spiritual bones of the universe. Egyptian maps made sure the gods and tax collectors always knew where you lived. especially if you happen to owe either of them anything. The Greeks, with their love of measuring and theorizing, brought in geometry and the radical idea that the world could be grasped with numbers. Roman road maps, meanwhile, were the ancient equivalent of a GPS for legions and merchants, stitching their empire together like a pair of very ambitious socks. In China, maps became tools for celestial harmony as much as earthly order, blending astronomy with administration in a way that makes you wonder why more governments don't consult the stars before budget season. And then, of course, there were the outliers. The Polynesian stick, charts that you could only read by memory and touch, and the medieval maps crowded with angels, beasts, and paradise, a reminder that mapping was as much about meaning as measurement. Even the errors and oddities in these ancient maps have something to teach us. They reveal what mattered most, what was feared, what was sacred, and who got to decide where the center of the world should be. Because, let's be honest, every culture has always put itself right, at the heart of things. The Greeks drew the world with themselves in the middle. So did the Chinese. So did the medieval Christians. It turns out everyone is the center of their own world, even if that world is balanced on a coconut stick, surrounded by monsters, or shaped like a cosmic onion. These days, we can zoom in on any street, watch satellites orbit in real time, and get directions to the nearest drive-through without ever glancing at the stars. Yet, underneath all that pixel-perfect precision, the same old urge remains. We're still trying to orient ourselves in something bigger, to answer that ancient, restless question, where am I? Whether you're holding a clay tablet, a roll of papyrus, or a glowing rectangle that sometimes doubles as a sleep video, the map is still a mirror, reflecting not just the world, but the wild, stubborn dreams of the people who made it. So, as you drift off tonight, maybe you'll find yourself tracing a line across the sea, or wandering the winding paths of a medieval city where monsters lurk just beyond the familiar. And if you do, remember, every map, no matter how strange or beautiful, starts with the simple need to find your place, if only for a moment, at the very center of the world.